Another edition of Beat the Closing Number presented by TheLines.com. You can follow The Lines on Twitter at TheLinesUS. You could also check out play.thelines.com for all of our betting contests, including for the Stanley Cup Final. My name is Eli Hershkovich. You can follow me on Twitter at Eli Hershkovich, and you can follow today's guest on Twitter at _Junkyard. He is Jeff Davis, the lead bookmaker for NHL, college baseball, and golf over at Circus Sports in Vegas. What's going on today, Jeff?
Eli, what's happening? How are you, bud?
I've known Jeff for a long time. He always hates when I bug him to come on the podcast, but he's very gracious to give us his time today. One of the best, not just bookmakers across the industry, but handicappers as well. So can't wait to talk about this Stanley Cup Final with him, especially because he's out in Vegas. And Jeff, the puck drops for the Stanley Cup Final on Saturday between the Vegas Golden Knights, the number one seed on their side of the bracket, against the Florida Panthers. Vegas is pretty much minus 130 to win the Cup at most books, but I believe minus 139 currently as of this recording on Monday afternoon over at Circus Sports. And Panthers won the President's Trophy last season, and then they go on to knock off one of the best regular season teams in NHL history in the Bruins on their way to making the Stanley Cup. And they were priced around plus 2,500 to win the Cup going into the playoffs. So on the surface, what's been your biggest takeaways, or what have your biggest takeaways been for the Stanley Cup playoffs entering this Cup final?
Well, really is just how close all of these games are and how many of them have gone into overtime. And really, they rightfully so should have gone into overtime. There hasn't been a lot where one team has dominated the other and ended up in overtime and lost. I mean, you look at I think the Panthers have won 6 games of their 12 in overtime so far this playoffs. And if you watched the Carolina series closely, I think if the Panthers swept Carolina, if after 4 games it was Carolina 3, Florida 1, I don't think anybody really would have been all that surprised because it played out just so evenly. And Vegas against Dallas, I mean, a 6-game series. Games 1, 2, and 4 were complete toss-ups, and either team could have won any of those games. So I just see 2 teams that are just so very close to each other, and from a power ratings perspective, and I think the number that's out there right now is a touch high. I think one could argue to me that my number I make Vegas about 52% to win this series, which is about minus $1.08. So like the plus 15s you see out there, I think is worth a bet. I think other smart hockey people could argue to me that my number's a touch low, and maybe they're right. I think I could understand it being, they could be as high as 53 or 53.5%, but any more than that seems excessive. And if you could find a plus 20 somewhere, I would think that that's an excellent bet. Whether or not it gets there, I have absolutely no idea, but I would think if this series gets played 1,000 times and you were able to bet the Panthers plus 20, you'd come out ahead at the end.
I'm going back to one of the things you mentioned early on in your handicapping for this series, at least heading into it, the notion of puck luck for Florida and for Vegas for that matter. Like you said, you have these teams pretty much even when it comes to your NHL power ratings, but you go back to the Boston series and Florida was seconds away from seeing their season end in Game 7 and then forcing overtime in the final seconds of regulation before winning it in OT and then going back to their last game in Game 4 of the conference finals, Matt Tkachuk scoring the game winner, and they were seconds away from going to overtime in that one. So how do you evaluate puck luck, I guess, and one goal variance when it comes to a team? And then in a fresh series like this, obviously your entire NHL power ratings come into play, not just a small sample size, whether it's a given series or one game variance. But with the Florida Panthers specifically, obviously, there were a lot of doubters even after they knocked off a historically great Boston team, at least going back to the regular season. So, do you think the Panthers got lucky on their way to the final, or do you think this path and this team is well deserved of being here and has a legitimate shot, like you kind of alluded to winning the cup?
So there's a lot to unpack here. I would say any team that makes it this far, I don't think lucky is probably a fair word, because over the course of, if you just look at like the landscape of sports in general, hockey is one of the most variant sports there is. I mean, how many times can you see during a regular season a team's a $3 dog, but the other team dominates, hits 4 posts, and the team that's a $3 dog scores 2 and wins 2-1. Was the team that won 2-1 necessarily the best team that night? No. So the variance really just applies in hockey, and the difference between the best team and say the 8th or 10th best team, it really just isn't all that much. I mean, the Bruins record, yeah, they were historically great in terms of points accrued in a regular season, but if you look at their underlying numbers, at least for the second half of the season, they weren't all that great. They just got above average goaltending and put the puck in the net when they had to, and they won a lot of games. Not taking anything away from the Bruins, but maybe the difference between them and other teams wasn't as great as the regular season standings showed. Then you take, looking at Florida's case, you have a guy like Sergei Bobrovsky who, had the monster playoff run with Columbus, signed a big contract, and found himself in a milk carton because you haven't seen him anywhere in years. But now he has, another unbelievable playoff run, and he's kind of showing his old, 2017, 2018 type form. I mean, the guy's won a couple of Vezina trophies. So he's found whatever has been missing for the last couple of years, and you combine that with, well, Florida doesn't have a deep roster. They have a handful of very, very good players. And what does it result in? You just, you got to get lucky to win some of these games, so to speak. These games go to overtime, and you've got to be the team that scores the goals. Like, they could easily be out at this point. But that being said, to say they maybe don't deserve to be here isn't necessarily fair either. So, yeah, I mean, I don't put a lot of like what happened in the previous series as far as puck luck. I just don't think you can apply it to series going forward. It just kind of all takes care of itself over time, the luck factor. But it all just comes down to getting the best number when you're making bets, and knowing what the price should be versus what the price is. And like, anyone who actually thinks they can, quote, pick winners in the sport of hockey is out of their mind.
Well, welcome to the gambling Twitter world, as you know very well, Jeff. And for the people that follow you or will be following you very shortly on Twitter at @double_junkyard, you brought this up on Twitter last night that a good price on Florida is worth a bet. And I think you noted that one book out in Vegas had around plus 125. Now, I was looking at Conn Smythe odds going into the podcast, and Bobrovsky, who you mentioned and broke down a ton within your handicap here, is around plus 200 to win the Conn Smythe. So typically you hear this sort of handicap when it goes into the championship round or game for any sport. Would you rather bet the player to win X award over the team to win the series or the game outright? So I'll ask you the same question. Would you rather bet Bobrovsky to win Conn Smythe at plus 200, a little juicier to the average bettor's eye, rather than betting Florida just to win the series?
So I will preface this by saying I am not an awards market bettor, because the voting just drives me nuts, and I see these votes constantly that don't make any sense. So I will preface my statement with that. Now, breaking it down, if you look at, I'm going to go into both sides here to get to my point. If you look at Vegas's skaters, you've got probably 4 guys that could theoretically win if Vegas wins the cup. And that's Stevenson, Eichel, Marchessault, Stone. But they're all so close in points that it would take one of them to have like a super series to separate themselves from the others to where that person would win the Conn Smythe. Also, Chandler Stevenson's name is Chandler Stevenson and not Mark Stone or Jack Eichel. So he would probably have to go absolutely berserk to win it, because if you look at the history of the Conn Smythe Award, it's always given to a guy with a big name. So he's probably up against it. You could take a look at Adin Hill. Granted, he didn't play the first series, but his numbers have been unbelievable. Posted a shutout last night. And you could think, okay, well, if this is a low-scoring series and nobody really separates themselves from Vegas, he could win. But then you look at how good Bobrovsky's been. I think it's possible that Bobrovsky can win the Conn Smythe and the Vegas Golden Knights win the Stanley Cup. If none of those guys go crazy and the voters don't want to give it to Hill because he didn't play, essentially the first series plus a game or two against Edmonton, Bobrovsky's the next logical choice. I think if Vegas wins the Stanley Cup in a low-scoring grinder fashion where like most or all of the games go under, I still think Bobrovsky can win. So getting back to the original point, 2-1 kind of feels like a good bet. However, there's also the possibility that Florida wins the cup and it's a completely wild series where every game is 5-3, 6-4. And now you're looking at, Tkachuk being the most logical winner in that case. So for me, as somebody who likes to try to dumb it down and get things, you make prices on things that are easier to make. So if you're making Conn Smythe, you've got to figure out what percentage of the time do the Panthers win, do players A, B, C, or D win the cup and win the Conn Smythe. And then in this case, I think it's possible that Bobrovsky wins the cup even if Vegas wins. So breaking that all down into a percentage is a lot more difficult, given because you got to get inside the head of voters who you don't even know who they are. So to me, I would rather just find a good number on the Panthers and bet it. However, I think in theory, there probably is some value with Bobrovsky if you can get north of 2-1.
It's a good point. A lot of good points. And especially when it comes to voters, I know there were bettors who were upset about the Miami Heat outcome. Caleb Martin was, I think, as high as 35-1 to win Eastern Conference Finals. MVP Jimmy Butler wins it. If you go back to a scenario that I was very familiar with in the NCAA tournament finale going back to 2022 with Kansas, Ochai Agbaji winning most valuable player, most outstanding player, didn't really make much sense considering what he did in the title game, but it goes to show you when voters have to hand in their votes initially in the first place, maybe less so in professional sports because I don't know how things are done versus when it comes to collegiate sports like the NCAA tournament, but at least in that specific instance. And then you also go into the notion of trying to figure out how a specific voter votes, which is, it's not implied probability. It's some sort of other analysis that you absolutely cannot quantify. So one other nugget or one other market that you brought up within your analysis there, Jeff, was the total, at least when it comes to Bobrovsky and handicapping how this series could go when you look at Conn Smythe odds, potentially higher scoring series, maybe the award goes to a goal scorer. But looking at the total for game one, it's sitting at 5.5. No surprise, a little bit of juice towards the over, and Vegas is pretty much favored, just like it is to win the series, I believe around minus 136, and maybe the exact price over at Circa. So what do you make of the handicap for game one specifically? And then when it comes to the series as a whole, what are the keys for both teams or either team to pull this thing out?
Well, I think, I don't know, and I haven't made a bet on game one to this point. And I don't know if I will or if I won't. if the numbers stay relatively close to where they are right now, I probably won't bet the game. That being said, I live in Las Vegas. There's a very, very, very high likelihood I'm going to be forced into betting the Panthers in game one, just because places will just take so much money and they'll move the number and there'll be a number to bet. But as far as actually trying to figure out what's going to happen in this game, if you are assimilating what you've seen out of these two teams, I kind of think it's going to be a low-scoring series. Vegas has really struggled on the power play, and that hasn't really – it's just been kind of all year, and that can burn some time off the clock. And frankly, Bobrovsky and Aiden Hill have been outstanding. Vegas and Florida have the second and third highest save percentage of any of the teams during the playoffs, only behind the Rangers. And the Rangers were out, the Rangers were out in the first round, so that sample size is a lot smaller. The only thing that gives me pause about unders is wondering if Aiden Hill and Bobrovsky can continue what they're doing. I mean, if anybody actually thought that going into the playoffs, Aiden Hill and Laurent Brossoit are going to win you a Stanley Cup, then, good on you, because I definitely didn't have that in the cards. And not to take anything away from the guys, have been incredible. So yeah, it's going to be physical. It's going to be tight. There's not going to be a lot of ice out there. I would bet the under if I had to pick a side, but just who the goalies are does give me some pause in making that bet. I think I would rather kind of want to just watch a game and see how the teams attack one another and see kind of what each team is doing and how it might relate to how they play going forward. So, yeah, I got nothing for you really on the total.
Makes sense. And I want to, as in our last few minutes here, like I mentioned in the beginning, you also deal with college baseball and golf and a couple of big events for both of those sports coming up, not only with the College World Series, but you have NCAA tournament regionals happening this weekend, I believe, starting on June 2nd. So Friday, and then the U.S. Open tees off on June 15th in a couple of weeks. So however you want to take it, Jeff, I don't know if you have any betting advice for regionals in particular, generally speaking, or anything specific. I know you're a huge golf handicapper, so maybe you have a long shot or two, or at least a golfer in the middle tier range that may be worth targeting. But however you want to go about the rest of the two or the other two betting markets that you focus on in particular.
So the College World Series is an event I get very excited for the last couple of years. And it presents itself the games are great betting opportunities. A lot of these teams, this is more from a game-to-game market than a futures market. A lot of these teams don't have pitching depth. And what ends up happening is in the first round, the regionals, the team that goes in the loser's bracket a lot of the time has to play 4 games in 4 days, and they run out of pitching. And it's important to try to follow along. It takes a lot of effort, but you're looking through box scores. You're looking through, okay, what team, who's pitched for this team, who's pitched for that team, trying to figure out who a team is going to start the next day is also a challenge because they probably just played, and whether or not you can get the coach might not have even decided yet. So a lot of the times you don't know who's starting until 45 minutes before the game. And these places are just kind of pricing things almost like, okay, it's this team is worth this team is worth that. This is the price, without really looking into too much of the pitchers, which, anybody who watches baseball knows the importance of a starting pitcher in a game and overall bullpen depth. So that's something that, without giving away too much, days 3 and 4 of the College World Series regional can present themselves with some excellent betting opportunities if you're aware of what to look for.
Great insight and information from Jeff Davis. You can follow him on Twitter at @double_junkyard, lead bookmaker for NHL, college baseball, and golf over at Circa Sports. And that'll do it for this edition of Beat the Closing Number presented by TheLines.com. You can follow The Lines on Twitter at TheLinesUS. And remember to head over to play.thelines.com to enter into our free betting contests, and head over to TheLines.com. Not just for getting the best odds on any sport and price shopping across numerous betting markets, but also getting the link in the top right-hand corner to our Discord channel to get all of our bets from staff members like myself on any betting market. This is another edition of Beat the Closing Number. So long, everybody.